Now that we have some animation, we can edit the animation and fine tune it. And one way to do that is to use some options that are on the timeline. I brought back the ball_fall_2 scene from chapter 10. And this animation has keyframes of frame 1, 10, 15, and 20. So what can you do down here on the timeline? One thing you can do is delete keyframes. So let's say I want to delete the keyframe at frame 20. I can move my timeline to frame 20, right mouse key right there on the timeline and get this special shortcut menu. And there's delete. So I'll click delete and that keyframe will go away. Once the keyframe goes away, Maya has to update the current position of the object. Because again, wherever there's no keyframe, Maya has to in between the position. It has to determine the position itself. So because there's no keyframe right now after frame 15, Maya had to determine what the correct position was for this area. Now, the part of the animation that is unaffected, for example, is the area between frame 1 and frame 15. No keyframes were deleted in that area, so all those in-betweens are still the same. So that's delete. I'm going to press Ctrl-Z to bring back that keyframe. We'll talk about some other options. Another thing you can do down here is copy and paste. So let's say I want to give this ball an extra bounce. What I can do is borrow the keyframes, say frame 15 and frame 20, copy the contents of those keyframes and paste them somewhere else in the timeline. So for example, I can go to frame 15, where there's a keyframe where there's a peak of a bounce, right mouse key on the timeline, and go to copy. And that copies the current value stored by that keyframe into memory, so copy. Then I can go to a new position on the timeline, say frame 25, where I want a new bounce. Then I can right mouse key here and go to paste, 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 paste. What that does is it takes the values from frame 15 and stores them in a brand new keyframe in frame 25. So now the position for the sphere at frame 25 is identical to the position at frame 15. So let's say I wanted to get it back on the ground again. I can go to frame 20 now, right mouse key, go back to copy, and then go to new position, say frame 30, right mouse key, and paste, paste. So now I've copied frame 20 to frame 30. Again, any given keyframe is simply a vessel that carries values, and those values are the values of the animated attributes or channels. So by copying, you're copying those values and you're pasting those into a new keyframe. That's often useful for any kind of animation that repeats or any kind of animation that cycles, like this ball bounce or maybe a walk cycle or something similar. Now, once you paste these new keyframes or just regular keyframes, you're allowed to add them as you would any other keyframe, or delete them, or move them. And we'll talk about moving in a second. For example, I can go back to frame 25 and say, well, maybe that bounce is a little too high for a second bounce. I can move the sphere a little lower, and then update this keyframe by pressing S to set a new key, so S key. So copy and paste are a great way to speed up the animation process, if anything has to repeat. Now, using a special control, you can also move keyframes on the timeline. Let me show you that. If you press the Shift key on your keyboard and click drag, you get a special red bar. Any keyframe within that red bar turns yellow. If you let go of your mouse button and let go of the Shift key, the red bar stays. That's a selection region for the timeline. What you can do is once that red bar is there on your timeline, is click drag to move it. And any keyframe that was within that red bar is automatically moved. So 10 was a keyframe that was highlighted here. I can click drag that red bar and move that keyframe to a new position. Once you click off that red bar goes away and the keyframe is left at the new location. In this case, I move what was a frame 10 keyframe to frame 13. That means the position that was stored in frame 10 now occurs at frame 13. So the position, in other words, the values of the channels don't change. They just occur at a different place in the timeline. It's often great to tweak your animation by moving keyframes around. Maybe a certain part of your animation happens too soon or too late. Well, this is a way to adjust that. So I'm going to click undo once again to return that frame 13 back to frame 10. We'll talk about a few other things you can do with that red bar. So again, you can just shift, click, drag on your timeline to get that bar. Aside from being able to move keyframes that are highlighted by the red bar, you can also scale them. And scaling is useful for changing the speed. Again, speed is determined by the distance the keyframes are apart. So for example, the ball is now falling from frame 1 to frame 10. If frame 10 was actually a frame 5, that means the ball would fall in 5 frames. That means the ball would be moving faster. If frame 10 was at the 20 position instead, that means it would take 20 frames to fall, and therefore the ball would be slower. So again, the distance that the keyframes are apart affects speed. So what you can do is scale groups of keyframes. So for example, I can go to frame 1, then shift, click, drag to get that bar again until it goes to frame 11. Let go of my mouse button, let go of the shift key, and then I can scale this section of the timeline. Now you notice there's a little arrow at the right side of this bar. That's a scale bar, so I can click, drag that little tiny arrow and push this inwards. When I push it to the left, that means that that entire range of the animation is being compressed into a shorter duration. So if I click off of that, the bar goes away. And I can see that I left what used to be a frame 10 keyframe closer to frame 4. Now, it's not exactly at frame 4 or frame 3. I've actually left it at a decimal value. The keyframe is now roughly 3.75 or so. And in fact, you can have keyframes at decimal places. Now, you can't affect them directly at a decimal place on the timeline, but you can affect them in the graph editor when they have an unusual number like that, 3.75 or so. The animation will still continue to play back, but just keep in mind that if you do scale using that red bar, that you might wind up with keyframes at unusual locations. So in that case, I've scaled that section down so that frame 10 got moved closer to 1 and wound up around frame 3. I can also do it somewhere else on the timeline and affect more than one keyframe. That time I really only affected frame 10. If I can go to some other part like towards the end, like around frame 20, shift, click, drag, and pick 3 keyframes. Now I have a keyframe here at 20, 25, and 30. Now I can scale this section. I can go 2 different directions now. I can scale from the left side. There's an arrow there. Click, drag that, and move the bar this way towards the right. And I still have my arrow at the right side and scale it this way too, so you can scale in 2 different directions. But by scaling in 2 different directions, both on the right and the left side, moving inwards, I've compressed the keyframes so they're all closer together. So here's the 3 keyframes here, here, and here. Now the duration is much shorter for this entire part of the animation. You can go even further and continue to compress these by click dragging those little end arrows. So now I've compressed them so much that they're almost just 1 frame apart. So now if I click off that, pick the sphere again, I can see that they're basically at frame 25, frame 26, and frame 27. So now that second balance occurs incredibly quickly over a period of 3 frames. Now maybe you don't want to compress your animation that much, but that's the option you have. I'm going to click off and press undo a few more times to get back to the way it was. So now I'm back to my normal duration. So again, if you want to scale the entire region, just shift, click, drag, and use the end arrows to scale. Now I scaled inwards that time, but I can also scale outwards. So I can pull the keyframes apart and therefore make that part of the animation longer and make the ball slower. So you can scale and move and do that in any order that you want. You can also move the bar so far that you overlap other keyframes, and that's an option, but that might make for a really strange animation. So it's better not to necessarily pass some other keyframe. Like I don't want to move it so far that I pass up the frame 15 keyframe because then the animation might not make any sense. So just be aware of where you're moving and how you're scaling. So those are a few tricks for manipulating your animation right here on the timeline. Now a more powerful way is to use a graph editor, and we're going to talk about that in several more videos.